I used to think the Russians were brilliant at conning the West, but having watched Tucker Carlson go to Moscow and do an interview with Putin, where Putin appeared to be a sort of an old geezer who's read too much ancient history and talked for half an hour of this interview about things that happened 700 years ago, I did have my doubts. But I think if you ignore Putin's rather crazy focus on ancient history, which no one really cares about this side of Europe, yes, I think they're still very good at it. And indeed, Margarita Simonian, who is the editor of Russia Today, actually called RT, the propaganda network, she said there was a very gratifying and welcome change in public opinion.
I'm joined now by Alan Philp, former Moscow correspondent and author of The Red Hotel, The Untold Story of Stalin's Disinformation War. Alan, thanks for giving us your time.
Lovely to be on the program again.
Alan, this comes a couple of days after President Zelensky and the Greek Prime Minister Kyriakos Mitsotakis also narrowly avoided a missile strike. How likely do you think that Putin is actually targeting these heads of state, both the Greek Prime Minister and Grant Shapps?
I think there is no doubt that Putin wants us to think that he is willing to attack a British Defence Secretary. Obviously, we went through 40 years of the Cold War, and I don't think there was never anything like this. So we seem to be in a world where we're dealing with a sort of bandit country where anything is possible. There are literally no limits of what he might get up to.
I mean,
Alan,
what would you think the fallout of such an attack would be?
It would be huge because anyone who still has some idea that Putin is a nice guy, they'd have to abandon that. I think the Russians want us to believe that they are capable and willing to do this, and they're quite pleased that the biggest story of the day is that Grant Shapps was afraid to go to Odessa. Now, there's an interesting thing here. The Russians know that the Americans intercept some of their military communications, and I wouldn't put it past them to have put something on a channel which they know the Americans might be listening into, so that the Americans would know and the British would know that that they were planning to do this. This was a possibility, and this is just another arm in their arsenal of ways to prevent the Americans rather successfully from providing the weapons that Ukraine needs, because they are all afraid of escalation, and they're giving the impression that Russia has no fear of escalation. They will do whatever it takes. So there is a game of smoke and mirrors going on here, which I think the Russians are winning quite successfully.
Are they traditionally quite good at this smoke and mirrors game, Alan? I mean, your book is all about that, The Red Hotel, the story of Stalin's disinformation war.
Well, Stalin ran rings around the Allies during the Second World War. You could read about it in the Red Hotel. I used to think the Russians were brilliant at conning the West, but having watched Tucker Carlson go to Moscow and do an interview with Putin, where Putin appeared to be a sort of an old geezer who's read too much ancient history and talked for half an hour of this interview about things that happened 700 years ago, I did have my doubts. But I think if you ignore Putin's rather crazy focus on ancient history, which no one really cares about this side of Europe, yes, I think they're still very good at it. And indeed, Margarita Simonian, who is the editor of Russia Today, actually called RT, the propaganda network, she said there was a very gratifying and welcome change in public opinion, which she said was all caused by her because she had a network of guerrilla guerrilla channels which were influencing the Americans, particularly on Capitol Hill in Washington, so that they would be afraid to keep supporting Ukraine. Now, we shouldn't take her too seriously, but there is definitely a change of opinion in Washington about continuing to support Ukraine. So the Russians are doing something quite successful on that front.
Alan, before you go, the Russian elections come to an end today. I don't think we're all on the edge of our seat to see who's won. It's pretty much a foregone conclusion. But what do the next 6 years of continuation of President Putin mean? Do you think he's going to use these latest elections as a mandate to go even further in his actions, particularly when it comes to Ukraine and his relationship with the West?
I think you're absolutely right there. They have busted a gut. They've extended the polling from 1 day to 3. They want a huge turnout, and I think they want him to get more than 75%, maybe up to 80% of the vote, so that he can show the Russian people he's the man, the only man who can lead them. He can show the Americans and indeed us that he's not about to go anywhere, and it will complete his transformation from a leader who started off being a partner for the West. He is now running a militaristic state with 40% of GDP of the budget going on the war. So he is on a war footing, and he will use this to say, we have to continue this war. You have supported me in this war, so we're going ahead, and we're not going to stop until we have victory, however you define victory. I'm afraid.
Alan, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Alan Philp's there, former Moscow correspondent and author of the brilliant The Red Hotel, the untold story of Stalin's disinformation war.